Hello, very good evening to you. President Trump has declared mission accomplished following overnight military strikes by the US, the UK and France on suspected chemical weapon sites in Syria. Mr. Trump said the action was taken in response to a chemical attack on civilians in Douma last week and described it as the use of righteous power against barbarism and brutality. Well, the Pentagon said the targets were a chemical weapons research unit in Damascus and 2 storage facilities and a command post near the city of Homs. Well, Syria's denounced the attacks but said they caused limited damage. Here, the Prime Minister said the action should serve as a warning to Syria and its ally, Russia, against the use of chemical weapons. But Russia's ambassador to the UN told a meeting of the Security Council that the missile strikes were an illegal act of aggression. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel.
3, 2, 1, feu de l'essai.
From a French warship in the eastern Mediterranean to a British RAF base in Cyprus to the USS Monterey in the Red Sea, days of planning was replaced by execution with bombing and missile strikes. The president said Britain, France and the US had marshalled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality.
A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
And he singled out Syria's 2 principal backers.
To Iran and to Russia, I ask, what kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep.
In Damascus last night, flashes, bangs and streaking missiles light the night sky. But those launching the attack seemed as keen to define what this mission wasn't as what it was.
This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties.
Daylight reveals the extent of the destruction. This is all that's left of the Baza Scientific Research Centre near Damascus, one of the targets that took the greatest pounding. At a Pentagon briefing this morning, Defence Chief said all targets had been hit, with no casualties suffered.
Good morning, everyone.
We're still conducting a more detailed damage assessment, but initial indications are that we accomplished our military objectives without material interference from Syria. I'd use 3 words to describe this operation: precise, overwhelming, and effective.
But in Damascus this morning, regime supporters were celebrating a success in repelling American aggression. Perhaps more accurately, the strike was more limited than they'd anticipated. This apparently is President Assad strolling to work today, although we don't actually see a close-up of his face. If he is able to walk tall, it's only because of the support he's receiving from the Russians. And today at the UN, they turned their fire on Britain, France and the US.
The US and its allies continue to demonstrate blatant disregard for international law. But as permanent members of the Security Council, they must be especially firm in protecting the UN Charter.
And that was positively restrained compared to what Syria's ambassador had to say.
I say that you are liars, you are spoilers, you are hypocrites. You are attempting to see failure in actions of this organization which do not pursue your interests.
Tonight, some of the French jets returned home. Along with the British and the Americans, they're hoping this is job done. But now the world waits to see if there'll be retaliation or any further use of chemical weapons. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, we get the latest from John in Washington shortly. First, though, Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow for us. And Steve, as one might expect, strong reaction and rhetoric from there.
Yes, and since Moscow is President Assad's biggest backer, it's hardly surprising, really, that the language coming out of Moscow today has been tough and uncompromising. So, for example, we heard Vladimir Putin describe the US-led strike as an act of aggression. Unlawful, unacceptable, said the Russian foreign minister. And we heard a senior Russian senator accuse America of behaving like a school bully. So, in the geopolitical school playground, lots of shouting then and some shadow boxing behind the bicycle sheds. But no fight yet between Russia and America. Neither want to go to war, really, over Syria. And we know, because the US ambassador to Moscow said so today, that before the strike, both sides took measures to make sure that they stayed apart, that there was no clash. But for how long can this continue? When will the next situation arise, which puts Russia and America, two nuclear powers, on a path to confrontation?
So, John, that's the big question then. But is that it for now? Is that operation over?
Well, Donald Trump used the perhaps ill-judged phrase by saying it was mission accomplished. Now, you'll remember George W. Bush during the Iraq War appearing on a battleship with mission accomplished as a banner behind him, and him saying that was the end of combat operations. And combat operations went on for many years afterwards. But I think the scope and the ambition of what Donald Trump and the other partners launched last night is much more limited. It is just about chemical weapons. If the Syrians, frankly, and the Russians want to go and bomb civilians with conventional munitions, that's fine. It's just chemical weapons that the Americans and the French and the British are drawing the line at. It's also been, the targeting has been very considered so that you don't hit any Russians or Iranians. It's not about regime change. And you saw that whilst the Russians may have had their air defense systems turned on, they didn't actually act. To use Steve's metaphor about the school playground, I mean, I think last year the Americans gave Russia a slap on the wrist with the attack in Syria. Maybe they've added a punch in the arm, but it's not a full-scale bundle. And there's been a lot of overheated rhetoric from the Americans and the Russians this week, but actually the actions that were taken were considered and very proportionate in the American view. Donald Trump actually ran into some opposition from the Pentagon about taking this action. They were wary that this could lead to escalation, and it seems that everyone has decided that's not what anyone wants.
No, John, thank you. Well, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, says the raid sent a clear signal that the use of chemical weapons would not be tolerated, and she said it had been right and legal to take action. But the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has called the strikes legally questionable. With more then on the reaction here in the UK, here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
2 a.m. at home, 4 a.m. at the target. RAF jets take off to strike at Assad's regime. By 9 a.m. in number 10, the Prime Minister emerged to explain her case.
There is no graver decision for a Prime Minister than to commit our forces to combat. And this is the first time that I have had to do so. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere.
Not just a punishment for President Assad, but about a wider principle too.
We must reinstate the global consensus that chemical weapons cannot be used. This action is absolutely in Britain's national interest. The lesson of history is that when the global rules and standards that keep us safe come under threat, we must take a stand and defend them.
Will you do the same again if President Assad does the same again, as you have suggested he has? And do you feel you have the public's consent, given that you have not even consulted MPs in Parliament?
We believe that the action was successful, but the Syrian regime should be under no doubt of our resolve in relation to this matter of the use of chemical weapons. And I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do.
Minister's legal advice justifies the strikes as an exceptional measure to alleviate humanitarian distress by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring future attacks.
Is that proof?
Yet without explicit UN backing, the Labour leader believes the strikes might not be legal.
The consequences of any country taking unilateral and action that has no legal basis are that it's an encouragement for others to do exactly the same and reduces our ability to complain when others do that. Surely, the United Nations exists for a purpose.
The Prime Minister will face questions from MPs on Monday, but no firm plans for a vote.
MPs have been powerless all week to hold the government accountable on this, and for us to have to wait another 2 days after the event really is not good enough.
There are major questions, major doubts. Is this a one-off or is it a continuing operation? How much control do we have over what the Americans are doing? We've got a very erratic American president who changes his position from one day to the next.
This was not intended to end the war in Syria, not part of an effort to remove Assad. But the Prime Minister wants these attacks to be seen as a clear and grave reprimand to a country suspected of using chemical weapons. An effort to force respect for the decades-old rule that such weapons are illegal and must not be used. But while Theresa May's decision to act was in her gift, what happens next may well not be.
The Prime Minister may hope her decisions have a straightforward outcome, but the political fallout may not be clean.
Let's pick up on that last point with Laura now. So a confident, robust even Prime Minister, but as you implied in your report, this is not without risk, clearly.
Absolutely not. And tonight the Prime Minister's been busy on the phone talking to a dozen or so leaders from countries around the world. A lot of warm words have been forthcoming from various allies, but the decision to take military action for any Prime Minister is always a lonely one, really, even with two allies alongside here. And the simple reason is Theresa May cannot be sure what happens next. The government's been absolutely at pains to explain again and again, this is just about chemical weapons, this is just about trying to restore the international rule of law in this particular area. But the wider situation in Syria is so messy, so complicated, there's no way that Theresa May can in any way be sure of that. What she can be sure of is that in the coming days she's going to face a hard time in Westminster, she's going to face lots of questions. And she has been so clear today in trying to focus on this one particular issue that appears for Number 10, yes, to be controversial, but straightforward. But we've seen on so many occasions before, British Prime Ministers have found that decisions that start off with clear merits can prove extremely tricky in the months and years afterwards.
Laura, thank you. So last night's strikes may appear to have been very clearly targeted, but they are being seen by some as a limited punishment on Syria. So what impact will they have on Syria's chemical weapons programme? And what do they say about the strategy of America, Britain and France? Well, here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
This is what provoked the strikes. Last Saturday's apparent gas attack on civilians in Douma. Britain, France and the United States are convinced this was the latest in a long line of Assad's chemical attacks and had to be punished. So what was achieved? The strikes sent a deliberate, precise, if limited message to President Assad. You are not the target, your chemical weapons program is. The United States fired missiles from 2 warships and from the submarine USS John Warner, plus in the air 2 B-1 Lancer bombers. The RAF flew Tornadoes from Akrotiri in Cyprus, staying out of Syrian airspace to fire their Storm Shadow missiles. And France launched missiles from its frigate Languedoc, as well as Rafale and Mirage strike aircraft flying from France. So the US was not acting alone, but with 2 close allies this time, and that's politically important. The targets of all this firepower, Syria's chemical weapons production. The main target for 76 missiles was a research and development centre close to Damascus, but also a chemical weapons storage site near Homs. 22 weapons were aimed there, including the RAF's 8 Storm Shadow missiles. And target 3, a nearby chemical weapons bunker, the main French target for 7 of their 9 missiles. But has military action damaged prospects for eventual peace in Syria? Definitely not, according to the head of NATO, America's wider military alliance.
If we start to normalize the use of chemical weapons, then we really risk that chemical weapons will be used more and more. For me, there is no contradiction between the strikes that took place last night and the efforts to support a political negotiated solution.
Still, Western strategy is to stay firmly out of Syria's war on the ground. Today, the Syrian army declared all of Douma under its control. The town apparently attacked with chemical weapons last weekend, and the rebels' last holdout in eastern Ghouta. Russia, with its forces in Douma now, is helping President Assad take back more and more of Syria. And it's that alliance which will surely dictate much of the terms of any eventual peace. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, in Beirut. But first, our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale, is at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, from where the British jets took off. Just how challenging, Jonathan, was this particular operation?
Well, the first thing to say is that these air crews based here at RAF Akrotiri are well versed, well practiced in these kinds of missions. Remember, they've been flying bombing sorties against the group known as Islamic State for the last 3 years. But this mission did have added risks and dangers, not least because of the Syrian regime's air defense systems and the fact that it's backed by a powerful Russian military. Now, tonight we've learned, as well as those 4 Tornado jets armed with those cruise missiles that took off in the early hours of the morning, they were accompanied by 4 Typhoon jets. They were armed with air-to-air missiles. This was a precaution in case they were engaged. As it turns out, those Tornado jets with those Storm Shadow cruise missiles, they were well outside Syrian airspace. Those cruise missiles have a range of up to 300 miles. Their target was a military base west of Homs, where the MOD believes the Syrian regime has been storing the precursors, the ingredients, if you like, of its chemical weapons program. Now, the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has assessed that these strikes have been highly successful, and he hopes it shows solidarity with the alliance, but also a warning to President Assad not to use these weapons again.
OK, thanks, Jonathan. And to you, Lise, then, can you give us a sense of the mood in Syria, the wider region, and what sense there might be retaliation?
Well, reaction in this region depends very much on where you stand in Syria's tangled crisis, and everyone in this region stands somewhere. So from President Assad's staunchest enemies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, there was full support for this military operation. From countries like Iran and Lebanon, there was harsh condemnation. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, described the airstrikes as a crime. But behind this criticism, there's also quiet relief that so far these strikes have turned out to be far more limited than many had expected, and indeed what countries like Iran had prepared for in the past week, moving their own forces on the ground to safer locations. But there could be another impact too. What we're hearing from Damascus today is even greater defiance from President Assad, his supporters and his allies, this alliance of Syria, Iran, Hezbollah. They call themselves the Axis of Resistance. And tonight, Iranian hardliners have begun to refer to Western powers as paper tigers.
Jonathan Beale, Lise Doucette, thank you.